Fire Emblem has been my favorite Nintendo franchise for years, and I feel confident in saying that will continue to be the case for years. After all, even with its stiff competition, one thing this franchise holds over the others is its lengthy, rich legacy. I mean, shoot, it was nearly there from the start of Nintendo's game publishing career, with the first entry releasing in 1990 on the Famicom, specifically the Famicom, as it was, act surprised, Japan exclusive. A frustration I'm all too familiar with at this point, but to be fair, the decision was somewhat warranted at the time. These games aren't just installments in the then niche RPG genre, but the even more niche grid-based strategy RPG, that premiere entry being one of the first of its kind as a matter of fact, only preceded by very few others, and even then, a lot about it is original. Fire Emblem is a very important series, with its earliest installments being very important titles. I owe it to myself to experience them as a serious fan, especially considering the kind of fan I am. While I may have found out about the games through Smash Bros and had Awakening be my tender first time with a mainline entry proper, I started to like the ways these older titles were designed a lot more. At least, that's how I felt with my sorta limited view, as the furthest back that I had gone was the first game released in America. Regardless of it being a lot more in line with the classic entries, there was still a noticeable divide between it and its GBA brethren against the games prior to them, and it all had to do with the fact that Fire Emblem 1 through 5 were all the product of the series' original creator, Shozo Kaga. They ain't just classic Fire Emblem, these games are Kaga Emblem, and the many factors that set them apart from the titles that already sported the classic moniker make them fascinating games to go back to. So I decided I would go back. All the way back, seeing just how good these seemingly important games really are. And we're kicking things off with Fire Emblem 1, baby, fully called Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light. Quite a mouthful, but we can't just call it Fire Emblem because that would then share a name with Fire Emblem that was the first entry released overseas in the States, which in actuality is Fire Emblem 7 or Fire Emblem Blazing Sword. And we can't just call it Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon because that would then share a name with Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon, which was a remake of this first game on the DS, also released overseas, and look, I'ma just save ourselves the headache and refer to this game as Fire Emblem 1. Relax, I'm only gonna refer to this first entry with the numbers. You can calm down, it's not that serious. Anyway, I got Fire Emblem 1's frustratingly limited Switch re-release back in 2020, yet it wasn't until recently that I actually beat it all the way through. Why is that? How was the game overall? Funnily enough, even though the series literally just started, answering these questions is kinda complicated. But if any part about it isn't complicated, it's the story. Prince Marth is fighting the freest continent, Arcanea, after the evil wizard Garnif and the evil earth dragon Medius have taken over. Get the magical sword, slay the dragon, and save your princess sister. That is basically it. Naturally, there are more details when it comes to the world's lore and some build up to the first in-game scenario, but no matter how you look at it, the first Fire Emblem tale is the most basic, by-the-numbers fantasy synopsis imaginable. I'm willing to give it a pass though. It is the first entry, and the idea of participating in this classic fantasy story was a part of the appeal when the game was released in 1990. Also, given that release within the 8-bit era, most of the storytelling will be through gameplay events. The little lines of dialogue more so serve to paint the scene, with details being in however you choose to play or in the instruction manual, where a more detailed explanation of what's happening is laid out. Hell, a lot more of a detailed explanation is in that instruction manual, including information on item strength and their effects, which was a status quo that hasn't always translated well when it comes to experiencing these titles in the current day. Especially in the 8-bit era, games expected you to read the instruction booklet to, well, instruct you on how to play the game. But since we more often than not play these older titles nowadays through digital re-releases or piracy, we don't always get the Sega Ages treatment where a detailed digital manual is a part of the product. That said, even with those external details, you still have to do a lot of number crunching to predetermine how combat exchanges will go. Maybe a bit too much. Attack minus defense equals damage, but attack is gained by adding your character's strength with an item strength, and that's not including item effectiveness. It's also hard to gauge your hit rate and speed with weapon weight and terrain advantage, not helped further with battle screens lacking firm numbers in favor of these unclear bars. Fire Emblem as a whole is inherently simple to get into, but when you have to calculate pretty much everything yourself, you're forced to engage with all the under-the-hood mechanics that diminish the series' supposed simplicity. And having to constantly do this was on its way to becoming tedious, but in an attempt to engage with the game more along the lines of how retro RPGs intended players to do anyway, I actually decided to take some notes. This was my replacement for an instruction manual, and doing so ended up making the act of calculating attacks and enemy damage output a lot more fun. It was essentially this game's grid-based map making you'd see in early adventure titles, and the act of doing so honestly helped me to better gauge how combat exchanges would go without having to constantly do the math. Sure, there were some frustrating hit percentages and surprises, but the game flow went by a lot smoother the further I played, and on top of this, I ended up finding a lot more to enjoy out of the title the more I'd progress. First and foremost, why didn't anyone tell me how great this game's map design is? Even though every ultimate goal is to seize the throne or castle, maps manage to be diverse by way of interesting layouts and side objectives. You're pushed to keep moving forward and not turtle due to time-sensitive towns that have excellent rewards, some even involving side quests for ultimate weapons and an easier time in the final battles. These quests feel like integral parts to the story, but surprisingly, you can straight up miss out on seemingly mandatory story beats. You never have to recruit characters like Lyn, Bantu, or Tiki. You're never required to forge the Starlight Tome. You never need to find the Pegasus Sisters, and by proxy, the Mercurius. Well, I know it as the Miracle Sword, but semantics. It's an 8-bit RPG, folks. The story is yours to make, and because of that, locations become meaningful by how you interact with them. Characters will matter based on who you choose and how well they perform, and events that happen within maps will feel so much more deliberate, memorable, and weighted. The latter especially due to the game's linear chapter-by-chapter structure, along with the strategic gameplay at hand. This game will constantly be pushing towards that finish line no matter how hard you stall, with there being no real means of risk-free grinding and plenty of circumstances where you either have to take action or get left in the dust. Combine this with the series defining permadeath, where if a character dies in battle, they're gone for good. Everything has a sense of permanence to it, serving to emphasize the strategy of this strategy RPG. It all may sound daunting, but the game is balanced around all of this. You never have one chance at getting a character archetype. You're bound to either find another one to recruit or get handed one upon starting another chapter. There's a reason you're given a bunch of axe users and sword wielders at the beginning of various missions. Should you lose someone, there's a high chance that you can find a replacement, or be encouraged to try a different strategy with a different type of unit. And those characters who do feel entirely unique just end up coming off as superfluous rather than a niche you absolutely need to win. Contrary to popular belief, Fire Emblem was designed around permadeath from the start, and few feel quite as balanced around the mechanic than the one that introduced it in the first place. From a foundational standpoint, Fire Emblem 1 has a lot of intentional design choices that have aged surprisingly well, and a ton of its ideas continue to be delivered in fresh ways across its decades of sequels. However, let's not fool ourselves. There are plenty of reminders that this is among the first of its genre, and it's a prime victim of a little term called first game syndrome. A term I think gets thrown around a bit too loosely for my tastes, typically being used for a game someone doesn't like that also happens to be the first in the series. I think a more proper use of this term would be for games that don't quite get their own design mentalities, with Fire Emblem 1 having a lot of problems you'd only see by way of the creative team not thinking about it since it's the first of its kind. For starters, isn't it cool how healers only get experience by avoiding attacks or taking damage? You know, healers, the notoriously frail units with no means of counterattacking. Matter of fact, magic users in general feel so awkward in the game's overall difficulty balancing. Magic damage always has a flat attack output by way of the tome stat instead of there being a magic stat you can grow upon level ups. And this damage remains consistent throughout the entire game, at least on your end, because not a single character gets even a point of the resistance stat by way of level ups. The only way a character will ever get a point in the stat and therefore decrease the amount of damage a spell can dish out is by way of the extremely rare stat increasing item, an item enemies never get to take advantage of. The game's biggest problems, however, were the lack of any battle preparation and the awful item management that comes with it. Two problems that go against this game's emphasis on strategy and why I feel the game warrants being labeled under the aforementioned syndrome. You can choose who to deploy in battle, but not where they spawn. In fact, you won't know where they'll spawn at all until you actually start the fight, which already throws a wrench in whatever kind of plan you wanted to execute right out of the gate. On top of this, you can't manage your unit's items prior to battle at all, whether you want to trade between characters or swap some items out of your convoy storage, which, believe me, would have been a godsend with how this game handles item management already. It's straight up abysmal, with the most you can do between units being to give an item, not properly trade. Unless you specifically go to its tent in the midst of battle, you can only send items to the convoy if you're given one after combat. And even then, you have to send the item you were just rewarded with, not something else you're holding that you may not need anymore or want. All of this just serves to overcomplicate what should be simple inventory navigation. It's unfathomable how much time you will waste moving items in the most unintuitive way imaginable. And believe me, you don't want to waste any more time in this game than you already don't have to, because, oh boy, Fire Emblem 1 was one of the most patience-testing games I have ever played in my life. As much as I try to avoid the notion, this was a time where I cracked and abused the re-release's speed up function. The amount of hours you will fill with dead space consisting of loading, sluggish animations, and enemy AI needing to stop and think about what it's going to do for seconds on end is maddening. In fact, this was ultimately my breaking point that prevented me from even finishing the game that first time through, and I still had a hard time beating it for this video. When it wasn't the game's speed though, it was those strategy contradictory design choices also serving to waste my time. Oh, and shoutouts to this first game having ambush spawns, by the way. They're always terrible and I will never like them. Clearly, there are some silly mechanics that litter the generally great foundation we discussed earlier, but ironically, learning to circumvent these pitfalls and even exploit some of them paved the way for some fun gameplay shenanigans, because as silly as this game can get, you can be silly right back. Outsmarting a game's design in general feels like an overarching theme to retro gaming as a whole, and this game's no exception. It's not like you have to use glitches or anything, but you will have to learn how to manipulate the game's AI and indulge in those really limited strong items and weapons. The Miracle Sword was my weapon of choice before finding the iconic Falchion, which did wonders for all the enemies' hate boner towards Marth. Merrick and Lind have unique spells that made them a force to be reckoned with, coupled with enemies having no resistance. Powerful stat increasing items made Sheeta a straight up monster on the battlefield, and of course, there's my beloved Warp Staff, an item that lets you teleport an ally to literally any tile on the map. There's nothing stopping you from skipping entire chapters if you want, yet even still, there's balance in this craziness. Because there's no way to grind outside of incredibly risky arenas, skipping an entire chapter means skipping out on an entire pool of experience and items. Weighing that decision is tactical in and of itself, so using this game's tools to outsmart it feels somewhat intentional. It's just that the things you are outsmarting also just as often feel like oversights because this is the first game of its kind. Do you see why it's so complicated to pin down this game's quality level? I truly believe that there's a great game here, but it's buried beneath so much first game syndrome jankiness that I have a hard time firmly saying that I like it. Despite eventually warming up to a lot more of it than I thought I would, including the cute 8-bit graphics and unironically great chiptune music, Together We Ride. Together We Ride. This is not to the series quality level that would eventually be made apparent. It's a game you play for the sake of seeing where it all began, with an emphasis on playing it, not beating it. A fine start, all things considered, and I'm sure that those who played it back in the day not only appreciated it more, but were eager to see what was next. And when it came to sequels during the industry's early days, it was impossible to predict what the turnout would be. You'd either get second game perfection or second game weirdness. Street Fighter 2 or Zelda 2. And as it would turn out, Fire Emblem chose to go in line with its fellow Nintendo example, resulting in Fire Emblem Gaiden. A stark contrast from the original, leaning more into the RPG side of the strategy RPG spectrum. And only released a year after the original, yeah, a year, remember when development cycles were short? But a lot can change in such a short amount of time, making for a very different Fire Emblem game than even what would come afterwards. The extent of my history with this game prior to now was about 10 minutes or so trying it after the remake made me curious. After a couple of maps plus a dungeon, I swiftly declared it as my least favorite Fire Emblem, returned to the remake, and never looked back. This was clearly unfair to the game though, and I'm ready to approach it with a more nuanced, mature perspective. Weird games can be cool too. I like weird. I like it when things are different, and with Gaiden, the differences start right from the get-go. We aren't in Arcanea anymore, nor are we following Marth. We're now in the continent directly to the west called Valencia, following two new protagonists, Alm and Celica. Their continent is split into two kingdoms, Zofia and Rigel, helmed by their two gods, Milla and Duma respectively. And being two sides in an RPG region, they're at war, with Rigel invading Zofia and Alm choosing to lead the resistance for the latter. Celica, on the other hand, wants to end this war by traveling to Milla's temple, as it should have been prevented by divine intervention from the jump. But signs of monsters spawning across the land and crops dying hints at the fact that something happened to the goddess, causing Celica to embark on this pilgrimage in the first place. Alm and Celica primarily go their separate ways, but fate connects the two who grew up together once upon a time, and their stories are more important to each other than either realize, making for a much more interesting tale than the first game overall. And I'm not giving a more detailed plot synopsis just because I like the story here more, but also because Gaiden has a lot more dialogue and blatant storytelling in the game itself. It's still an 8-bit RPG at the end of the day, meaning you aren't going to get cutscenes that go on for too long, but it's more than a generation's norm, let alone the title preceding it. In that vein, the cast this time around is a bit better, at least the main characters are. Marth is a cool anime swordsman, but that ends up kind of being it. Alm and Celica, in contrast, are cool anime swordsmen with just the slightest bit more characterization to latch onto. Again, it is still an 8-bit RPG, but there's more here for me to chew on, and a little bit ended up going a long way. The game looks about the same, with some new animations to go with new classes to have a bit more pizzazz to them. The character portraits are a lot better though, with that going double for the soundtrack. It's one of my favorite 8-bit OSTs, let alone one of my favorites in the series. If Together We Ride is in the Fire Emblem Music Hall of Fame, then so is With Milla's Divine Protection and Arc of Dawn, being Celica's first battle and overworld themes respectively. Got some bangers too, but in this case, girls may in fact get it done. Then on top of all the new stuff this game introduced as a result of second game weirdness, that of which we'll get to in a bit, to my surprise, it's thanks to Gaiden that magic has become a really cool part of the Fire Emblem battle system. There's now a magic stat so that magic users can scale with the rest of the game's difficulty curve, the resistance stat is more widespread, not to mention obtainable through level ups, and instead of tome durability, spells use HP as a resource, making for this neat risk-reward mechanic where you put your life on the line to dish out damage. The latter didn't stick around unfortunately, but the former aspects were here to stay, rounding out this side of combat in a very satisfying manner. Healers were tweaked a little bit as well, but they aren't quite there yet. They're still frail and don't gain experience through healing, but they don't gain any by avoiding enemy attacks either. Instead, they're all given an attack spell in order to partake in combat, which is now the only way they can level up. A nudge in the right direction, but not where they need to be entirely. And on that note, we've now officially discussed everything I like about this game. It didn't take long for me to figure out why I dropped it so quickly, but after getting even further, let me just say, thank God for Shadows of Valentia. God, where do I even begin? With a higher emphasis on more traditional RPG elements, Gaiden not only has your typical Fire Emblem maps, but an overworld, towns, and dungeons. But whoops, they're all mediocre. The overworld ends up being a glorified menu where you point your character to a destination, but once you get to the third act of the game, enemies will start spawning on the overworld, rushing your character over time. You'll then get ambushed where the enemy can attack you first, and at an alarming amount of the time, potentially kill a unit of yours before you get the chance to move. I repeat, one of your units can die before you even have the chance to move in a game with permadeath. Naturally, you'll want to get the jump on the enemy mobs first, but if you happen to attack them at the location of another enemy map you need to beat to progress, you'll just add even more enemies to the map than usual, which can often lead to an overwhelming amount of forces your small army has to deal with. Despite the fact that you have two groups to control, this game has a much smaller cast than the series norm, let alone in comparison to the previous entry. And since your barracks are so small and you can deploy all your units on normal chapters, when someone dies, you simply have a hole in your squad. Sure, when you go into dungeons, you're forced to bring your first 10 units exclusively, but you'll be battling outside of these locations way more than you won't. Not to mention, fewer characters means fewer niches filled. It's not like you have a bunch of healers to replace your current ones should they bite the dust, meaning that when someone dies, there's little reason to not reset. And when permadeath stops being a choice, it ends up being an insanely frustrating punishment. The towns in this game barely qualify as such, and dungeons don't fare much better, being a bunch of empty rooms with the occasional fight. In fact, as soon as I got into my first battle within a dungeon, I very quickly came to the conclusion that Fire Emblem is not a series that lends itself well to dungeon encounters. You and the enemy are plopped into an arena and told to keep swinging until one side drops. There's literally no map design, meaning no room for strategy. It's all about stats. Not to mention, this is still an NES entry, and the game runs just as slow as FE1. Well, okay, technically the game doesn't take as long to load anymore, but animations are still just as lengthy, enemies have a bunch of health from the beginning, and their health takes a million years to drop because Gaiden's accuracy rates is bullshit. Who the hell decided to jack up evasion rates this much? Now more than ever, I would love to see some actual numbers instead of these dumb bars, because nobody can seem to hit anyone, and as far as this bar says, it should be near perfect accuracy. Why am I missing so much? So help you if the enemy decides to go to an evasion tile, by the way. At multiple points, you'll end up surrounding an enemy camping on one of these damn things, just praying that any one of your units will finally land a hit, which never failed to make me livid. Not helping this is the new and improved enemy AI. They don't have as much of a hate boner towards the protagonist anymore, but they're all cowards who will run away once they reach low health in pursuit of, oh boy, an evasion tile. And more often than not, it's an evasion tile that will also heal them at the start of each turn. Hope your units can catch up, but they probably can't because all of your on-foot units have crap movement, despite the fact that the game's maps are ginormous. Look at all of this empty space. What are we doing here? You're a couple of games early, Gaiden, and you missed the point of that later game's large large maps anyway. Because of this, along with the accuracy issue and all the annoyances that already slowed down FE1 to an insane degree, it pains me to say that Gaiden was even slower. I felt no shame in abusing speed up for this game, and I encourage you all to do the same if you play it. This amount of time wasting in battles should be illegal, lessening the low amounts of fun you'll already be having during combat thanks to some frustrating new enemy types and the scarce healing to compensate. In Gaiden, you'll only be recovering health by way of a select few items or a healer. Yeah, no vulneraries, all because item management as a whole got a complete overhaul for the worse. Every unit can only hold one item. That's it. It doesn't have to be a weapon because every unit has a base weapon they'll be able to fight with, whether they have something equipped or not. But that base weapon will soon be outclassed and you'll want to equip something stronger. But now you've taken up your single item slot that could also be used for a stat modifier, or a piece of defensive gear, or literally anything else. It's way too restrictive, arbitrarily limiting your options in a way the game doesn't feel designed around. And if you want to say that it's for the sake of customization, then I'm gonna have to say it's lame in that department too, because there aren't even that many items in the game. You'll find a very specific amount throughout the campaign, with the few that enemies drop in a non-scripted manner having a lower drop rate than fucking Fire Emblem heroes. What a peculiar problem. Here's a thought. Maybe in the towns this game wanted to shove into the Fire Emblem formula, we could have, I don't know, thrown in a shop or two? Where are the stores? Where's my money? Where's my resource management? Weapons don't have limited uses either, and that takes away a key element of the tactical gameplay seen in FE1. Heck, these maps being so large with nothing in them also lack that tactical edge, with the chapters consisting of you storming an enemy stronghold being just as bad, only in a different way. This game has the worst selection of maps in the entire series, and they felt designed in this manner to compensate for the game allowing you to grind. Or maybe they're designed this way to encourage you to grind, but no matter which one it is, they're equally as bad and feel so counteractive to what makes Fire Emblem, Fire Emblem. Full disclaimer, should I make more Fire Emblem videos, you will hear this rant again because I can't emphasize enough how much having an overworld and safe means to grind completely destroys the strategic portion of a strategy RPG. Answer me this, why bother making smart choices when you can just grind to hit harder than the enemy and take no damage? What's the point in divvying up experience and delegating kills when there are a bunch of easier mobs you can farm back in the previous dungeon? When you can grind to your heart's content, there's no reason to even think anymore. Battles lose that tension because there's nothing stopping you from just reaching higher numbers. And because maps have no elements for you to interact with strategically, even someone like me who prefers outsmarting Fire Emblem games rather than outgrinding them will eventually just start to do the most optimal course of action in a game that's clearly designed around it. Every wall I hit in this game wasn't met with me trying to solve the problem at hand, I just knew that I was at a level disadvantage. Or maybe I wasn't camping on evasion tiles enough, because even after I would grind, turtling still brought me more success, and I was never punished for doing so. I hope it doesn't sound like I'm trying to push an agenda for linear Fire Emblem games, but this is just how it is and why I have my preference. Other open map Fire Emblem games don't get it quite as bad as Gaiden, but the point still stands. Grinding undercuts the need for strategy. In pursuit of being a more traditional RPG, Gaiden and the games that took inspiration from it all sacrifice a lot of what makes the series unique. And at least in this game's case, it ends up being half-baked both in terms of the strategic and RPG ends of the spectrum anyway. So, after losing enough units to enemies who ambushed me on the overworld, slogging through environmental elements that did nothing but waste my time, and getting screwed over by an accuracy issue made that much worse by enemies camping in fortresses I'm constantly forced to storm in these awful maps, I couldn't take it anymore. I try not to do this, I am an unfortunate victim of the sunk cost fallacy, but even this masochist has his limits. I dropped the game, and taking the titles I've already experienced into consideration, this might be my least favorite in the series. There's a clear reason why Kaga Emblem went right back to the linear format and never looked back. I have an appreciation for second game awareness as a whole. I think we can find some cool ideas through experimentation, which this game does showcase, but this just ain't it. So, quite the interesting start to the series, huh? What can I say? Sometimes it takes a second for a new IP to get its bearings, and if I may be so bold, despite FE1 and Gaiden being the first two entries technically speaking, I don't know if I'd classify them as the series' true start. If anything, they feel like a trial run and an experiment. Both games did a substantial amount of groundwork for the franchise and saw how much of its own formula could be bent, which helped to further define its own design philosophies. But I don't think either one of them quite understood what being a Fire Emblem game truly meant yet. A part of this could be because the needed technology wasn't there, but I primarily think it's because these were simply the first of their kind. There was nowhere to look for inspiration or guidance, so they just needed to throw out some ideas and see what stuck. Because of this, while they're both interesting games, and a part of me has come around on FE1 in particular, they're not worth playing all the way through. They just aren't. They're time capsules to appreciate through retrospect. And while playing them was an eye-opening experience I'm grateful to have done through a nonsensically limited re-release and an awesome fan translation, I'm ready to see some self-actualization, kinks to be ironed out, and for Fire Emblem as a franchise to get its real start going. Clearly, this is just the beginning.